All right. Hello. This is our Kin 301 lab. With us, I have Curtis Wright, David Tran, Andy Sanchez, and Noah Rosado. Uh, this presentation is about flexibility and force and how it affects regarding static versus dynamic stretching. Quick little recap of the whole experiment. The purpose is to explore the concepts and effects of static and dynamic stretching while understanding the results each type of stretching brings and how they differ from each other. The measurements taken, we used an isokinetic dynamometer. We measured the range of motion, passive torque, passive stiffness, and isometric muscle force. We used a total of 16 healthy young men, approximately between 22 years of age. We found a considerable increase in both range of motion and PT after both stretches. Passive stiffness and isometric muscle contraction decreased significantly after both stretches. And we found the effects of static and dynamic stretching proved similar. There was generally there was no difference in results, but if you look into the specifics, which we'll go into later, there was slight specific differences. In conclusion, we could say both static and dynamic stretching generally showed paired results in factors regarding increased range of motion and PT and decreased passive stiffness and isometric muscle force. No difference in said factors while performing static versus dynamic stretching, although there might be outside benefits or cons to each of these stretches. A little bit of background information just to understand the experiment better. The importance of stretching. Static stretching is when you stretch, pretty much when you stretch and you're not really moving body parts. It's just almost in a fixed position. Dynamic stretching is using motion as stretching. Range of motion is basically the amount of degrees a joint could move. Passive torque was the resistance to motion in the opposite direction of the joint. And passive stiffness is resistance to muscle to change its shape. The introduction, static stretching is a component of warm-up exercises commonly performed to improve flexibility, which has been proven by studies that tested the theory through range of motion, passive torque, and passive stiffness. Static stretching also helps reduce the risk of injury. Recent articles have reported that prolonged static stretching can have detrimental effects on muscle performance and should not be performed when participating in higher level, more competitive activities. Dynamic stretching has been proved by studies that dynamic stretching improves muscle power, jump height, sprint time, and has been recommended as a warm-up for more high-level and competitive activities. In this study, we sought to compare the effects of static stretching and dynamic stretching on, again, range of motion, passive torque, onset of pain, and passive stiffness, as well as isometric muscle force. We hypothesized that dynamic stretching would be more effective than static stretching in terms of enhancing performance, and that the effects of dynamic stretching on flexibility parameters would be equal or greater than the effect of static stretching under the same stretching conditions. So what we did for the experiment with the method, we used 16 healthy 22-year-old men. They completed either static stretching or dynamic stretching on the right hamstring for a 30-second or 300-second period with 20 seconds rest period. For static stretching, each participant took a standing upright position, extending your leg, and placed their right heel on a 50-centimeter high platform. The participant then reached forward with their arms toward the extended leg. Example of static stretching. And then dynamic stretching, each participant took a standing upright position beside parallel bars and held the bar with their left hand for stability. To stretch the hamstrings, the participants contracted their right hip flexor with their knee and flexed their right hip joint so their legs swung up, so like motion stretching. We first measured the range of motion, passive torque at pain onset, and passive stiffness, and then measured the isometric muscle force immediately before and after stretching. All dependent variables were obtained using the isokinetic dynamometer as mentioned in the abstract. The torque and angle signals from the dynamometer were subjected to analog to digital conversion and stored in a personal computer. Uh,
All right. So for the data and results, what we found was for the range of motion and passive torque that there was a significant increase both after stretching, doing static stretching and dynamic stretching. Whereas for passive stiffness and isometric muscle contraction, it decreased after doing static or dynamic stretching. But for all of them, the effect size, which is the difference between the pre and post stretching, there was a large difference for both of them, as in there was some form of a change, whether it went up or down. However, for both of them, there was no significant difference between static and dynamic in terms of like which one performed better, as in they had a very similar performance. You can go to the next slide.
about that.
No, you're good. So the discussion in this study, as we mentioned before, we compared the effects of static stretching and dynamic stretching on range of motion, pain threshold, passive stiffness, and isometric muscle contraction. And the original hypothesis was that dynamic stretching would outperform static stretching in enhancing muscle performance and flexibility. However, the results showed no significant difference between static stretching and dynamic stretching across all measured parameters, at least not to the point where you can definitively say one is better than the other. Both stretching methods led to increased range of motion, pain onset, or passive torque, and it also and alongside decreases passive stiffness and isometric muscle contraction. While static stretching was expected to maintain muscle performance, both stretching types cause similar reductions in isometric force, which may relate to changes in muscle stiffness. And the effects on flexibility parameters, both range of motion and passive torque, were consistent between static and dynamic, indicating both would be effective for pain and injury or effective injury prevention strategies in athletic environments. Some limitations of the study include the focus on longer stretching durations and absence of measures like the electromyography or contraction speed. And in future experiments, they plan to explore shorter durations and additional performance metrics. But in short, out of the whole word bomb, both static and dynamic stretching effectively enhance flexibility while reducing isometric muscle force with no significant difference in their impacts. You can go to the next one.
And the main takeaway we could take from this is that static stretching helps us increase the muscle length and the overall and improve the overall flexibility of it. While as dynamic stretching helps enhances like the strength and output our power output of our movement. But in the end, they're both relatively the same. It just really depends on what your uh it depends on like what you're like really trying to do. And so the next slide for the and if we were to apply these stretches in the real world, you would typically use the dynamic stretches for like sports, fitness, or rehab to like warm up your body, have like have like the blood flowing, whereas like static stretches is more like a post recovery to uh to like to elongate our muscles and to oh shit. Um wait, sorry. Can we redo? So sorry.
I don't know if she would
Uh,
mind.
that was static stretching versus dynamic stretching overall. No big difference between the two, but they did show similar benefits and uh, cons for each one. Thank you.
Oh, we're good with that.
I think it would be funny.